The thing had my grandmother's face. During the summer of my 7th grade year, me and my family decided to take a trip up to Alabama to visit my grandfather's estate. My grandfather had just recently passed away due to a massive heart attack. So, unsurprisingly, my family was very distraught. My mother was the will executor, so she was in charge of the estate and taking inventory of all my grandfather's belongings. As we pull up to the house, I get an eerie feeling. To give a little perspective on the setting, I will describe the house. The house is located in a white rash neighborhood filled with druggies and weirdos. A couple years after the visit, the house would be broken into and the copper from the writings in the house would be stolen. So that gives kind of an idea of the scumbags my grandfather had living around him. The house itself kind of looked like the house from the Amityville horror movie. It was 2 stories with a basement. It had 3 bedrooms and 2 baths on the top floor and 1 bedroom and 1 bath in the basement. It had wood floors and the ceiling was unpainted. The only place in the house where the ceilings were somewhat painted was in my grandparents' bedroom. It had an X pattern and a sequence of patterns across the ceiling. This bedroom was particularly big and had a bathroom in it. It is also the room my grandfather died in. My grandfather was 6 feet 7 inches and 300 pounds, so I had guessed at was what had attributed to his heart attack. The house's exterior was made of wood and sat on 10 acres of land, another 100 acres if you count the land that was leased. The land was littered with old rusty cars that my grandfather used to collect parts from. The inside of the house was rustic and the furniture looked like it was bought from a Goodwill. It smelled musty, a smell I can't associate with too many other things. Just to be clear, I'm not knocking the house. My grandfather built the house with his bare hands, so I had a lot of respect for it. He and my grandmother had spent the first 3 years building the house living in the basement. The basement smelled even worse than the upstairs. It smelled like old, dead air. The kind of smell you would smell at an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. It had a kitchen, a living area, and a bedroom. I liked to spend a lot of time down here snooping through the wide variety of items my grandfather had down here. From old radios to old police monitors, my grandfather had everything down here. On one particular day, my parents were outside taking inventory of the vast collection of mechanic parts, and I was snooping around in the basement. As I was down there, I started to hear noise above my head. It sounded like footsteps coming from my grandparents' bedroom. I figured it was one of my parents in there to get something. I shrugged it off and continued with my snooping. The sounds never went away though. It sounded like a crescendo, starting soft and gradually getting louder and then starting all over again. It sounded as if it were walking back and forth. I decided to go up and investigate the noise. But no one was up there. I was creeped out, to say the least, so I joined my parents outside where I stayed for the rest of the day. Fast forward to night time and I was back in the house. I was forced to sleep in my grandparents' bedroom despite my protest. Luckily, I was sharing the room and the bed with my grandmother, who happened to join my parents on the trip. My parents would sleep across the hall. I and my mom got into some sort of argument and I was forced to go to bed early. I was in this creepy bedroom alone while my grandmother was right outside the bedroom in the living room. She was watching TV. Despite the noise coming from the TV outside the bedroom was extremely quiet. It seemed to take on an aura of its own. The bed faces the door going out to the living room and the bathroom door sits on the right side of the bed. So, here I was in this creepy bedroom lying on my back in bed. As I was laying there, I began thinking about the footsteps I had heard earlier in the day. Didn't like it in that bedroom. The air inside that room seemed suffocating. As I was laying in the bed, I heard a noise inside the bathroom. I lay there motionless with my head turned towards the bathroom. My eyes were locked on that closed door. This bathroom wasn't big at all. It was like the size of a storage closet. I will never forget the noise that was hearing from that bathroom. It sounded like a gargling sound. It sounded like a choking gargling sound. I really can't explain how scared I was. I just lay there paralyzed with fear. Several seconds went by, although it felt like hours before the sounds quit. It fell silent again, even more silent than before. I was still too scared to move. I wanted to scream out to my grandma, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. I rolled over on my side so I could permanently keep my eyes on that door. A few minutes A haunting in eastern Pennsylvania. When I was first married to my second husband, we rented a house in eastern PA. It was an old carriage house that had been converted into 2 apartments and then turned back into a 1-family unit. We experienced a lot of paranormal activity in this house. My kids would hear me calling them, only it wasn't me and I hadn't called them. A substance resembling blood would run down the wall of my husband and my bedroom, right above our bed. It might have been a kind of mold, but it was creepy nonetheless. There was a constant tapping noise behind the refrigerator. When I screamed at it to stop one morning, it only got louder and more intense. One of my sons was watching a program about footsteps up a staircase, and as soon as he shut off the TV, he heard the same kind of footsteps. The most disturbing occurrence was when my daughter, who was 5 at the time, saw a woman in a white wedding gown in her room. The area where her face should have been was all black. My sons witnessed her too. She pointed at my daughter and then flew out the window. When a family of mice moved in, we moved out. The presence of mice is sometimes thought to be a sign of a haunting. The house was later demolished and a new house was put up in its place. I often wonder if the new owners experienced anything like we did.
The Lady in the Tree. There was a huge oak tree in my grandma's backyard when I was about 6 or 7, which has been cut down since. Where I lived, it wasn't uncommon for someone to have oak trees somewhere in their yard. But this tree was stripped of its bark, making it a grayish color. There were no leaves, and never once did I see anyone I visited. I hated going in the back to play by myself. The branches always seemed to be looming over me, seeming to be dark even on a bright and sunny day. One day when I got bored and decided to go outside to play, I decided to swing on the tire attached to a rope hanging on one of the branches. It was innocent enough. My grandmother was inside washing the dishes, but she could see me through the window, as it had a direct view of the entire backyard. I sat down and slowly started to swing. The branches croaked and squeaked each time I went back and forth. It sounded like it would break at any moment, but it was pretty sturdy. I'd used it before. Suddenly, I got a creepy feeling, like something was watching me from above. I was too scared to look up. I looked through the window to see if my grandmother was still there, but when I looked at her, she was looking above me, a terrified look on her face, her hand covering her mouth. It felt like the sun suddenly vanished and a misty fog rolled in around me. When did that get there? I couldn't move. My fight or flight had me at option 3, frozen. I started hearing a creaking sound on the branch above me like something was swinging back and forth slowly. It wasn't me. I hadn't moved within the last 2 minutes. I almost started to cry when my grandmother finally came rushing outside and over to me, quickly moving me. She shielded me from seeing what was on the tree. Nothing was said when we got inside, though I think she didn't want to freak me out more than I already was. My grandmother moved from that house a few months later after cutting the tree down. She didn't want me to come over after that, but now that she's in her new home, she lets me come over whenever I want. A few years later, when I had remembered the incident, I asked her what happened. She sighed. I had a feeling she still didn't want to tell me, and answered with the most terrifying answer anyone could think of. A woman was hanging from her neck. It was all twisted and the bone protruded through her skin. But she wasn't dead. She had a look of death in her eyes, and she was fixated on you, struggling to reach you. When I got to you, she started choking on her blood. After hearing that, I was glad she had shielded me from seeing that. I'm happy that I never went back there. And I'm happy the tree was cut down so no other child has to experience what I went through. I did some research and found out that in a couple who had lived in this house before, the husband beat and killed his wife, snapped her neck, and hung her on the tree to make it look like suicide. It seems he wasn't in his right of mind.
Creepy. For the past 30 days, at exactly 2:34, I've been awoken by a child screaming. Every single night, for 30 nights. I would say the child is around 5 or 6 years old and a female. Living in a small neighborhood, I know everyone who lives here. I could list all of them right now without having to think about it. I know for a fact that all the children that have ever lived here are well over 25 now and have left the neighborhood to live somewhere with better job opportunities. No one has moved here in the past 12 years. At least that's what I thought until last night when I looked out of the window after being awoken again. Being a widow since last year, I live by myself, except for my cat who slept through it all. I wiped the steamed-up window and peered out into the half-lit street. In the middle of the road was a small, rather slim child. Everything about them seemed normal, except the fact they were standing on the road at 2:34 at night, and their eyes. Even squinting out into the dimly lit lane, I could easily make out those eyes. So white, they were almost glowing. There was no visible pupil, and not once did I see them blink. They were just staring straight forward. Suddenly they fell to the floor, and another scream pierced my ears. There wasn't anyone nearby that could have knocked them over or a car in sight. It seemed like a huge gust of wind had blown them over, which would make sense, but the weather had been eerily calm all night. I debated whether I should go outside to make sure they were okay, but a part of my brain told me something wasn't right. I stayed put, keeping my eyes on the small child lying on the hard, cold floor. There was no sign of breathing, and I realized they could be in danger. I reached for my phone and turned it on, no signal. I looked back out onto the street and they were gone. Like they had vanished into thin air. I managed to convince myself it had all been my imagination and slowly got back into bed. Just as I pulled the covers over myself, I heard the door banging 2 times. I sat up straight. Someone knocked again, 3 times this time. I reached under my bed for the gun I kept there. For knocks, sharp and clear, interrupted me. In my head, I tried to piece everything together. Suddenly I realized. Every night at 2:34 I heard a scream. 2 knocks, then 3, then 4. I started to panic, fear spread through my body. The door crashed open, and that was when I blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital. 3 cops were sitting beside my bed. I closed my eyes again, then heard them speak. They said someone had called them after hearing a scream. They said it sounded like a woman, probably in her 50s. I realized then what that meant. I'm a 56-year-old woman. Every night I heard someone scream until it reached the end of the month and it was my turn. I sat up. I asked the police officers if they had caught anyone. They said no. I asked them who had called. They said it was anonymous. The only clue they had was a ring they had found in the middle of the street with the letters R.W. engraved on it. R.W., R.W., R.W. I scanned my head for people I knew with those initials. Only one person. My dead husband. Robert White. They asked me if I would like to see the ring in case I could identify it. They brought it to me and I took it into my hands. I knew this ring. I had the same one on my finger with my initials on it. This was the ring I had given my husband for our 30th anniversary. He had never taken it off. He was buried with it.
The house I grew up in. I had a good childhood for the most part. I grew up in a neighborhood that had plenty of kids my age to play with. There was a lake with a rope swing for hot summer days. Growing up in Florida, a shady cool lake was a welcome reprieve. My grandma even lived next door to us, and it was nice having her close by. When I was 12, things started taking a sinister turn. The first thing I remember happening was one night I was lying in my bed watching TV and my closet door swung open, hit the wall, and slammed shut. I ran to the living room where my parents were and in tears told them what had just happened. As my parents sometimes do, they didn't believe me. That night as I tried to fall asleep, I heard something bang on our utility room door. It sounded like they were trying to break it down. Real quick, let me give you the setup of my house. It was a long hallway with rooms off of either side. You could stand at the front door and see the back door. My dad had a utility room/workshop when I was about 8, and it made the house look huge. The actual living area was really small though. Anyway, because of how small the house was, I heard the banging loud and clear. I screamed for my parents and they both came running in my room. I told them what I had heard and my dad went to check it out while my mom tried to calm me down. My dad found nothing and I ended up sleeping in their room that night. After that, the activity in the house picked up. We would find things completely out of place. Car keys would be in the kitchen, and a vase that was on the bookshelf in the living room would be in the bathroom. Just objects out of place everywhere. This was also when I started seeing a black figure at my bedroom door. At first, it would just stand there and stare into my room. I told my mom about it and she said I must just be dreaming. I was not dreaming. I was wide awake. Soon the figure started coming into my room, closer and closer to my bed. It was terrifying. One night I got up the nerve to try to run past it. It didn't touch me that I could see, but I was pushed back onto my bed with such force that my head hit the wall between my room and my parents' room. My mom came in to see what happened, and I told her. She looked at me with concern and told me to just come sleep in her room. I continued to see this figure at least 3 times a week until I was 15. One day I had had enough and I went to talk to my grandma. I just told her what I had seen and described what it looked like. She said that she thought it was my grandfather, her husband. She told me that he had been an abusive drunk. He got his thrills from scaring his children, my dad and uncle, and being physically abusive to her. I asked why she didn't leave him and she said she tried twice. The first time he found her at her sister's house alone and threatened to kill her if she tried it again. The second time he found her and she said he almost did kill her. She wouldn't go into how though. After I talked to her, the activity stopped. Just like that, no more. I never saw the figure again. When I was 21, my mom died of brain cancer. The activity picked up again. One day I was playing PlayStation in my room and I smelled her perfume. Lady in White, It was her favorite. Once again, items around the house would go missing and be found later in weird places like the bathroom closet. I worked overnights, and one morning I came home to find my mother in the kitchen in the dress she had been buried in. Just standing there. She was looking right at me. She smiled and was gone. I continued to live with my dad, and when I was 24 started dating the girl I am married to now. One evening I got off work at 10 p.m. and we decided to go out. She came to my house to pick me up, and as I was getting my stuff together we were standing in the living room. She said, "What the hell is that?" I looked up, and on the ceiling there were brightly colored circles going in a circle right above our heads. Remember the door I heard pounding on? Well, while we were looking at the circles dancing around, that door fell. Just fell right off the hinges that had held it in place for 16 years and landed right in the middle of the hallway. We walked over to the door and just stood there staring at it, then got the hell out of there. My dad had been on a business trip, and when he came home I told him what happened. I could tell he didn't believe me, but considering I wasn't the partying type or someone who just took doors off of hinges, he didn't know what else to think. He put the door back up on the same hinges, all the while muttering that he didn't see how it could have just fallen off. After that, my girlfriend's cousin had gotten married, and quite a bit of her family had come in for the wedding. Two of her cousins that she hadn't seen in years ended up coming back to my house with the two of us, and we had some drinks, listened to music, and just had our little party. Her cousin Terry had to use the bathroom, and when he came back he asked if we had recently had the bathroom redone. We had, but there was no way he could have known that. He started walking around the house and was saying things like, "That end table used to be in that corner, didn't it?" When he got to my parents' room he said, "Your mom or a motherly figure is in here." He then described her to A.T. At this time my dad and I had pretty much packed up pictures, and there were none of my mom out anywhere that he would have seen. He described my mother sleeping with a knife in her bed, which was believable since she and my dad had a pretty hostile relationship when he drank too much. He also described what our kitchen had looked like before we had it redone. Still, no clue how he knew all of this. One night my girlfriend stayed the night at my house when my dad was on a business trip, and since it was bigger, we slept in my parents' bed. At about 4 a.m. she woke me up and said, "I just saw your mom standing by the closet." I looked over and there was what looked like a cloud of smoke still there. Another time my girlfriend was sick and left work early. She came to my house and I went to go get her medicine. When I got back she was asleep on the couch, covered up with a quilt. I just assumed she had gotten it off my bed. When she finally woke up I gave her the medicine and she thanked me for covering her up. I told her I didn't do it and she said she certainly had not, so we just put it off to my mom again. I've lived in 4 different places since that time, and in each of those places, something paranormal/weird has always happened. I don't know if it's attached to me or if I just happen to get all the weirdo houses, but since this is so long I'll end it here.